Okay, I think we're live. Okay, good morning, everyone. This might be a weird format since we're so used to being together in person, but the church has a different event. So we're doing an online free school this time. It's December 21st, 2024 edition of the Saturday Free School for Philosophy and Black Liberation. And today we will be discussing, having an open discussion of what are the capacities of the ruling elite, and is it possible that they are at their weakest since the last 100 years? Um, but without further ado, I'm going to let Dr. Anthony Montero begin our discussion, and I'm really looking forward to it because I think this is one of the most urgent questions of our time right now.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Emily Dom, and good morning to everybody. I guess we're starting late, so I just, we talk a lot about the current crisis, and without a concept or knowledge of what this crisis is and how it affects various classes within American society in particular, but the Western world, without understanding all of the complexities of the crisis, you can't understand it. And I find it interesting that that so many people who are radical use the word, but do not use it properly. I know liberals and conservatives talk about a crisis, but I just, it's a crisis of modernity. In a lot of ways, the history of modernity is the history of the European struggle, the class struggle, and the ideological struggle. In 333 AD, at the Council of Nicaea, which is really in what is today Turkey, the Roman Empire, which had collapsed, was then appropriated by what became known as the Holy Roman Empire. The empire dominated by Christianity and the Catholic Church. Catholic meaning the universal church. That unity would be broken initially by the separation of the Greek and Russian, ultimately Ukrainian Orthodox churches from the Western Church. So when we talk about Catholicism, we're talking about the Western Church, and as such, ultimately about Western civilization. What is called the Middle Ages, middle because it comes between the period of the Roman Empire and the period of the rise of the bourgeoisie, of liberalism, of science, and of a new stage in the struggle with the church. So in a lot of ways, we can, loosely associate Martin Luther in 1517 posting his edicts on the door of a Catholic church in the town I forget the name of right off the top. But this, and by the way, Martin Luther was a bishop in the Catholic Church. So what he did as a protest, as an attack upon the Catholic Church, it was a break from within this universal church, which claimed itself as the center of an empire. And it did unite all of these various factions and groups and classes within Western Europe and Southern Europe under the banner of the Holy Roman Empire. I don't think we should take this lightly. It was more than a religious unity. It was a political unity. The church, as the church, was a powerful state and political entity. The center of the Holy Roman Empire was the Vatican, and while there would be monarchies throughout Europe, they all declared obedience, so to speak, to this larger ideological unity. I think this is very important to understand because we talk a lot about ideology and its significance. Once you say that it is an empire based upon Christianity, or as they called it, Christendom, you are saying it is an empire that is held together by ideology. Hence, an attack upon the Christian church, as Martin Luther did, could be considered an attack upon the unity of this vast empire. Just keep in mind that nothing similar happened, at least I don't know of anything similar to have happened in the Greek Orthodox or the Russian church or the Ukrainian church or the Ethiopian Orthodox church, which was very similar in its ritual and so on to the Russian church. I don't know of anything similar, but this was a Western movement. And what Martin Luther did is now viewed by many historians as one of the first political actions of a rising bourgeoisie. The capitalist class could not come into being. I don't want to say could not, but it would have looked very differently had there not been an ideological break with the church, which meant with the empire and the various classes, in particular the landlord class, that upheld it, the merchant, landlord, and other elite classes. A few years after Martin Luther pins his, I think, 95 edicts upon the church door, a uprising, a peasant rebellion kicks off in Germany, led by a peasant leader who was also a priest within the Catholic Church by the name of Thomas Munzer. And there's a very famous small book written by Karl Marx called, I think, Peasant Uprising in Germany. And this famous figure, Thomas Munzer. And these kind of peasant uprisings were occurring all over the world. We hear about them in China in particular, similar to the peasant uprising in the 1520s in Germany. But for almost 400 years, Europe was beset by permanent war and permanent civil strife. In this kind, a lot of people talk about the great achievements of philosophy, of art, of literature, and all of this was taking place in the throes of this great ideological struggle for modernity and the future. I'm fascinated. I'm sorry Kathy is not here, but I'm fascinated by figures like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, who were their patrons were the church. But they, in painting, these ceiling paintings in churches and so on, and murals, as it were, they were also expressing certain values that were not in line with the church's theology. And people, I think scholars look upon them, Leonardo and Michelangelo, as not just avatars of the European Renaissance, but as figures of modernity. And I think if you study the figures in the paintings, for instance, the Sistine Chapel and all of that type of thing, it reminds you of what Shakespeare would be doing in literature. But we could come back to that. But nonetheless, through these 400 years of civil conflict, 7-year wars, permanent wars between states, between groups in society, real artists produced that was new, which suggests that revolutionary struggle produces great art. There is no great art that is not associated with revolutionary struggle. Mediocre art, counter-revolutionary art, decadent art is associated with counter-revolutionary times. The Renaissance was part, the European Renaissance, which, by the way, came it's according to how you define Italian Renaissance, Dutch Renaissance, this Renaissance. There were Renaissances all over the place, but usually the Renaissance is seen as preceding the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is more associated with people like Martin Luther and that period. But the Renaissance comes, you could say the 14th and 15th century is kind of, this embryo of something new about to be born. And its earliest expression was in art, and it was still confined within the church because the artists needed patrons of church or rich landowners, But yet and still, the Renaissance, which more than not is associated with painting, I think that's its highest achievement, although also literature, but really the painting. And yeah. And I guess the most lasting element of the Renaissance is painting. And of course, later on, I don't want to talk a lot about the Dutch masters, the painting, this realistic portraiture. See, portraiture is very important too, because it established the unique and individual qualities. And just a small thing. That's why, Baldwin could write, and he sounds like a, quote, man of the Renaissance, or he can talk about how I came to love Shakespeare. These types of things where there is a certain resonance of that revolutionary moment in art and painting, etc. And, by the way, just Baldwin, his detail to the individual, this constant search for the biographical and the autobiographical, which is, I think, just the way I receive it, it's more like the Renaissance than it is the Enlightenment, pure and simple Enlightenment. But anyway, but this long 400 year or maybe a little more, history of Europe is the history of the breaking of various peoples and nations from the church. And that is why the great debates within the modern political theory, church and state. Where does the state begin and the church end? Is the church the state? Does the church legitimate and authorize the state? Or is by the end of early modernity, this conflict, this two-sided conflict, and atheism and Protestantism were attacks upon the church. We must see it that way. Rationalism is an assault upon the church. When I say the church, and this gets, because the church then becomes the authority of what Christianity is and what piety is, what faithful, how you interpret the Bible, what is the Bible, the split between the King James Version of the Bible, King James, of course, English, and the Catholic Bible, the same in many ways, but not identical. Different theologies even, but we can come back to that. In the United States, we did not have this thing of the church. We have what we call denominations, Methodism, Baptist, the AME. They're all denominations, Unitarianism. They're all denominations within this vast network of ways to express Protestantism. Protestantism is from the word protest. And that's why, all Protestantism in one or another way is rooted in liberation theology. Because it is a fight against authoritarianism and the authority of the church. But we are a nation that did not go through this long period of ideological struggle associated with defining Christianity. The positive thing about the American revolutionary framing of things is that because we don't have a church, people can find their own way. And we've been studying that to a certain degree in Black Christianity. Black gods of the metropolis. It's no big thing. We'll set up, like Prophet Cherry. I am a Jew. And the Jews say, well, no, you're not. He said, well, I'm not seeking, you can't define Judaism for me because you're fake. That back and forth. Or the Nation of Islam. We are practicing Islam. The Saudis say, well, no, you're not. And they say, yes, we are. And they say, well, we in Mecca and Medina, we are the center, and Al-Azhar in Egypt, the great university, we are the center of Islam. And the Honorable Elijah Muhammad said, but of that Islam, but we had to reform Islam. You know what I'm saying? So, but it's uniquely American, where we didn't have to fight a church, like the Catholic Church. We would just form a denomination. You know what I'm saying? And I think no people have done that more prolifically than Black people. We have so many denominations, it's hard to know where they begin and where they end, That's why when Alice and Eddie and I went to the Garden of Prayer, now they're part of a denomination, which one I don't know, but It's a denomination, and we do our thing. You know what I'm saying? It's really a very democratic process in this sense, and it should be studied more. Um, so the lack of a church, the lack of actually, and this is something that we have to understand about American history. Yes, there was genocide of some Native Americans, not all Native Americans. And in some ways, we have to understand the history of Native America. The Seminoles are not the Cherokees. The Cherokees are not the Plains Indians. Very different histories. And so the Seminole, who a lot of people say were a mixture of Native peoples and Africans, and the Seminoles were a safe haven for slaves who were running away. You know, now they, in so many different ways, are not the same as Plains Indians, who didn't know anything about, pretty much about enslavement or Black people. But the Cherokee did. But each of these peoples constitutes something singular and unique. To call them Native American is a shorthand way of saying the people who were originally here. Where they came from, we usually think across the Bering Straits. They are, in a lot of ways, Mongol people, Asian people. What we call Native Americans are descendants of Asia. And, you get, Moorish science will say that the Native Americans, especially the Seminole, are instances of Africans having crossed the Atlantic before Europeans did. And I think there's some evidence of that. And Moorish science claims that they were early Moors, that they were Moors. The Moors who ruled Spain and the Iberian Peninsula for 600 years. They were North Africans. So just a small thing. The populating of the Western Hemisphere, what we call the Western Hemisphere, probably took place through two ways. One, over the Bering Straits, which assumes already that Asia had begun to be populated in a major way. That there were Southern Asians, there were North Asians, but that these, we would assume, basically nomadic peoples ultimately transversed Northern Europe and Siberia and came down through the Bering Straits, through what we call Alaska. And so that West Coast and the Plains Indians were probably an offshoot of that. Another offshoot, we don't call them Native Americans, are what we call the Eskimos, who were had to be technologically very, very advanced to have made settlements, productive settlements in that cold region. How did they do it? What was their architecture? How did they survive? Others continued down the West Coast, different culture. But then the other path was across the Atlantic. Transatlantic travel probably goes back thousands of years, and it did not begin with the Vikings, because the most efficient way is across the Atlantic, because what do they call it? The Atlantic Stream, it is easy to travel from West Africa to the Western Hemisphere. That is an easy route, and rather than the Viking route over the Northern Atlantic. Uh, so, I just say all of that to say the early populating of what we call the Western Hemisphere, what we today call the United States, began thousands of years ago. The Native American people are an ancient people. Some are more nomadic. I think the ones that came across the Bering Straits are more nomadic peoples. The ones who came across the Atlantic came later, I think, and are more settled people. You know, so yeah, but I'll just stop there. But, and of course, genocide, and I want to make this clear, against some Native Americans. Early tribal peoples were not wiped out completely. And then you must connect them to the Mayan and Aztec civilizations of Mexico and Central America, which I don't know enough about, but these great civilizations, the foundations of which would become European settlements and ultimately European colonialism. But anyway, we'll come back to that. Now, ultimately, the church, which lost power in the face of revolutionary ideas, of revolutionary struggles, the civil wars in Europe from the 16th to the 20th century have been the most violent wars. I include Civil War, include the World Wars along with that. The most violent wars in human history. And it's so interesting how Europe as a civilization emerges from all of that. It's very fascinating to me. You get people, for instance, Afrocentrists, hardcore feminists, postmodernists, who say, well, all of that is useless. They're white men, they're white people. Why should I be concerned with what they think or what they say? I prefer to go back to ancient Egypt. That defines me. And I think that's fictional and mythological. We are all drawn into this vortex like gravity, the vortex of modernity. Europe defines so much of the modern world. And just like the struggle for European modernity was a struggle against the Catholic Church, the anti-colonial struggle is not a struggle against modernity per se, but a struggle against empire. So there is an analogous thing going on here. Last week at Zion, I think when I thought about it more, it reminded me of the dying Catholic Church in the later stages of early modernity, where there was either open rebellion against the church and the priests and the property of the church, culminating perhaps, let's say, in the American and French revolutions. The British, of course, Catholicism in Britain became the Episcopal Church or the Church of England. Very similar to the Catholic Church, but different. And so we today identify Episcopalians as Protestants. But in some ways, it was a further separation from the Holy Roman Empire as well. But at Zion last week, you had all these young people and a few older people. We showed the documentary, and the younger people were asking questions about the church. And these older people, and we talked about this in the reading group at Zion, were pushing back. Like the young people say, the church is not speaking to me. Well, what did you do? Is that as though they're defending something that is dying. Zion Baptist Church, and no church, is what it was in the period of the Civil Rights Movement. And so here you have a church that is contracting, no young people. And but that's not unusual. Young people, if I'm not going to argue with you, I'm just going to walk away from you. And the people who were defending Zion, and I defend Zion, but who cannot look at it self-critically, what they are saying, you're walking away from the church is a sin in itself. Walking away from the church is abandoning God. That's the way they want to see it. And it's such a silly thing, frankly. And then they create this whole fiction about what Zion was. The only problem is I was there. And I didn't see none of y'all. So, I mean, what you talking, anyway, I won't get into that. But it's analogous to the undoing of the Catholic Church in the crisis of modernity. The other thing is not unusual or specific to the Black churches. The whole issue of mainline denominations. You know what the mainline denominations are? They're the white denominations, which are considered the pillars of modern Christianity in the United States. The Unitarian Church, the Episcopal Church, the Presbyterian Church, the Methodist Church, I think two or three others, I forget off the top. Maybe the Southern Baptist. The mainline denominations, as we spoke about in Free School, are in crisis and decline. Part of the crisis, we see it in the Episcopal Church. The Episcopal Church, if it doesn't appeal to immigrants, and essentially illegal immigrants who they protect, without that, they do not attract the American people to them, and especially young people. And that's the crisis of Unitarian Church, crisis of Episcopalians, and they have no members. Nobody comes. I know with Unitarianism, at least here in Philly, they tried to replace their great civil rights and anti-slavery struggle with a kind of queer theology, which is a postmodern theology. Okay, let me just go quick. Now, I say all of that to say that these ideological foundations of the modern Western ruling classes, when they are weakened, when the masses of people walk away from them, it weakens the capacity of the ruling class to rule. This is what we're looking at today. I would suggest that the American ruling elite have never been this weak, have never been this confused, have never been this ideologically and politically uncertain. That is why, and this crisis is also part of the crisis of knowledge. We can call the crisis of knowledge the crisis of ideology. If there is not the church, if there is not Christianity, what is European modernity? Well, indeed, it is science, it is reason, it is Kant, it is Hegel, it is Marx, yes. But that is social political theory. But the church, and this is why the Vatican and the Pope and all of that are so uh, prestigious because they are seen as the reservoir, the container of modern European civilization. Yes, you can have uh, science, but the church represents civilization. That's where I see it. That detente between science or reason and the church only consolidated after World War II. The church essentially did not reconcile itself to modern reason and science until after World War II. Even today, reconciling itself to atheism. You know, for the sake of Western civilization, we must have a detente, a peaceful coexistence with reason, with secularization, with secular society, which I think it took World War II finally to establish the, how would I say, pretty much that the liberal bourgeoisie did not have to apologize to or swear allegiance to religion. And that the church, especially as the United States becomes the center of European, well, at least European empire, the values of the United States, where the church, where the state separates itself from the church without apology. A nation which never had anything other, at least in its constitutional thinking, its political thinking, never had anything other than a separation of church and state, which made the American people in many ways more, quote, free in the political sense than the European people, even though it appears sometimes that with the rise of communism and radicalism that European working people were more advanced than the Americans. Yes and no. But I just want to kind of, what does it mean? Okay, this is good. What does it mean when the American ruling elite are weak, confused, anxious, where they question their own capacity to govern, to rule? What does it mean when nihilism becomes such an important part of the ideology or the philosophy of the ruling elite, where what we are looking at in many respects is social and ideological disintegration? There's much to learn from the previous histories of Europe and this struggle. It looks, though not the same, there's similarities. An ideological crisis which weakens the old ruling elite. In the case of the 400-year struggle that I talked about, the church eventually had to come to a rapprochement with secular society and with the liberal state. And the church is not seen as a hegemonic center of a center of the ruling class, at least of its ideology and civilization, but the church is just another, like in the United States, the Catholic Church is just another denomination. Isn't that interesting? From the Holy Roman Empire to just another denomination. It is a step down. And even with all of its beautiful cathedrals and churches, uh, it is now a weakened and confused institution. And in the United States, the predominance of energy coming out of religion was in the Protestant churches. And of course, the civil rights movement, and especially King and uh, other theologians and stuff, opened the possibility that Christianity could be revived. And as King said, connected to Hinduism and Gandhiism, but more than anything, to the liberation struggles from colonialism. So liberation theology, whether it was called that or not, was at the center of this reform, this radical reform of Christianity. Uh, and then if you go back to that time, that's why I say, the people at Zion, I don't know what the hell they be talking about. The church and Zion itself was this great church that you could barely get in, 1,000 people every week, attending service, because it was connected to the freedom movement. Not connected to a great cause, it becomes what it is. A bunch of old people waiting to die, and a bunch of young people who are waiting for them to die. Isn't that interesting? And I think history is on the side of the young people. One, because they're young, they're going to live longer, and you old asses are going to die, But in the wake of this, for instance, Cornel West, who I can't quite understand. Cornell, for most of his public career, has been associated with the more liberal wing of the Democratic Party. And to see him in any but that way is to misunderstand him. His politics had always been connected to the Democratic Party and elites within the Democratic Party, albeit the more left wing, the more social democratic wing, but always Democrats. He always voted for Democrats, although he always advocated for everyone having freedom of speech, that we should all, no dissent should be illegal, or blase, blase, blase. But he's a Democrat. And one might say that he's a Democrat politically, but his theology is more radical, closer to King. I am not convinced that his theology understands King. I think while being and he is a registered and ordained minister, Baptist, I think, he's still a secular thinker in philosophy. And therefore his secular philosophical positions aligns him with the lesser of evils. What he saw with the election of Trump and this political realignment is a catastrophe. The word catastrophe in Cornell's lexicon is close to the philosophy of nihilism. And Cornell, in this eclectic mix, that's why it's so hard to understand. Well, you say one thing one day, another thing another day, and you can't get an anchorage, a grounding in where his philosophy is. So what I have found is that he's closer to a form of European existentialism, which is also connected to nihilism and to what he calls catastrophe. And therefore, he concludes that the individual must live his or her life standing up for certain things, whether or not the world hears him or her, or whether or not the world is prepared to follow them. I think the assumption is that most people will go in the opposite direction from their views. But it is a view that says that the current crisis has no resolution, that the current ruling elite might collapse, but that would only further the catastrophe, that Trump his election is an indication of the undoing of society and civilization. Cornell would argue we should vote for Harris or Biden because this is Angela's, they give us time. Well, you said that about Hillary Clinton. You said that about Kerry. You keep talking about give us more time, but then even when we get more time, you guys have no strategy for struggle. So I'll just end by saying this, that we're looking at a very weakened ruling class. All calculations for the future of struggle of the people has to take into account a ruling class that does not rule, cannot rule, a ruling class that rules while trampling underfoot the majority of people. We saw it most recently here in Philadelphia with a Black majority city council voting for an arena for a basketball team in the face of one of the worst crises that Black people in Philadelphia have ever experienced, which means you rule on behalf of rich people, not on behalf of the people that elected you, and the people that elected you know that. That's the same thing with national politics. So I think we have to take into account a weakened ruling class, which questions its own capacity. I'll stop there, Emily.
I was really struck by the way you started with, the way you talked about how the Holy Roman Empire. Well, first of all, you said that today the crisis is a crisis of modernity. And in some ways, tell me if I'm absorbing this right, but that the Holy Roman Empire was more than religious unity. It's an ideological unity.
And political.
An ideological and political unity. And that.
Or let me just say this. Okay, I just say it was the center. See, once the Roman Empire collapses, the center being Rome, a new empire that appropriates in a certain way the doctrine of the very person that they killed, Jesus, but then appropriate, quote, his teachings, if you will, for the sake of empire. A new empire, a holy, a Christian empire. Mm-hmm.
Okay, that helps because I feel like what your intro does is it defines the crisis today as a crisis of modernity that starts with, like, from the Holy Roman Empire and then Martin Luther as a political action, like a political action by the radical bourgeoisie. Like from that point to now, it's kind of a disintegration of like the way you said, the history of Europe has been a long history of the breaking of peoples and nations from the church. And in some ways that is kind of like the disintegration of an ideological political unity based upon like Christendom or whatever. And so also, maybe I missed this, but I was also trying to place the anti-colonial struggles in here, because in some ways,
Emily, could you say that again? You kind of broke up.
I think it's just someone needs to be muted. Let me. Oh, maybe it's Doc. I mean, kind of that basically the anti-colonial struggles in some ways was the first big showing of the contradiction of European modernity, which already in itself, European modernity was, well, I don't know. I'm basically trying to place everything in this history because Martin Luther, and then even the way you said that like the art during the Renaissance was actually revolutionary art, because in some ways, even though the patrons were the church, the art itself was already kind of dealing with the art itself plus Enlightenment was already kind of like dealing with certain revolutionary questions that contradict or go against kind of the political and ideological unity of like the whole of like empire based upon Christendom. And so already kind of what is a long history of Europe defined by like the disintegration of like church and state plus the anti-colonial struggles kind of has to be linked to what we face now, because what we face now is really a what we face now is a crisis. It's not really of governance, like governance is related, but actually it's a crisis of modernity, European modernity. Because the very people who thought in some ways like Europeans, and then even you could say like white Americans or like the West, the white world, who thought that actually they had resolved certain things to like white modernity or European modernity into white modernity, actually has been shown that it cannot last or like does not solve everything. Oh yeah, go ahead, Jeremiah.
Well, I feel like it's really interesting because over Thanksgiving, I don't know if can you hear me okay? Okay, I'll speak up. Over Thanksgiving, I was in Italy with Nuri. We were traveling just for vacation, basically, but we went to Venice and Florence, and I know different people have said this before, and I know it's also come up in like reading groups, I think, in different ways, but something it's very striking to me is, on the one hand, Europe in many ways, although I know that this is like a very kind of maybe a surface level observation or intuition, it feels kind of like a carcass, in the sense that it's like you have essentially all of these huge churches, huge monuments, all of this magnificent art, and it's all in all of these museums, but it does feel like the glory days of Europe are over, and people come to Europe simply to see essentially Europe in its past glory. And the other thing that was very striking about, going to all these cathedrals, like in Florence, there's this really beautiful basilica. And what's also very striking about it is that even when we're talking about, the long history of the development of the Renaissance and of the Enlightenment and of essentially what flowers into modernity, I think part of what's difficult to wrap your head around, especially living as we do in a modern time, is the time scale of these developments, where it's like, even, for instance, like it may take like some of those cathedrals, it took like 200 years to build, And I think that that's something we kind of take for granted today, of like just the amount of time all of these developments took. And even if we, for instance, see the Renaissance as a revolutionary period relatively in the long history of Europe, the Renaissance itself was like maybe a 2-century long development. And I think it's, part of it is, we take for granted essentially what modernity has created the possibility for, which is history to proceed much faster, I think, than essentially how it has proceeded over the millennia of human history itself. So that's something that was really interesting. But even in terms of the art too, like I remember you would go through like these museums in like Venice and all this stuff, and you'd essentially see like the same, essentially artists who did the same paintings over and over again over hundreds of years. So like the Madonna and Child, I feel like the Madonna and Child was the one that I noticed the most. Also like the Annunciation, all that stuff. And part of what's interesting is that like basically over this period of hundreds of years, you do see the changes, and you see the also the ideological changes kind of in this like nascent form of like small changes. Even like for instance, if you notice like there's a time in Europe's history in which you have all of these artisans who are commissioned by the church, and they're all essentially nameless. But then you reach a certain point, and then the artists start to have names. They start to sign their own work, and that itself speaks to essentially this like slow birth of the rise of the individual, the rise of this kind of humanistic thing. And I remember we actually saw the original David statue by Michelangelo in Florence, and part of what's really fascinating about it is that like it's simultaneously a biblical, like it's purportedly a biblical kind of figure, but its essence is essentially it's much more humanistic. It's much more about the celebration of the human form, of like this new humanism which emerges with the Renaissance. And I think that, I don't know, I was just reflecting on that as kind of like, yeah, like even just the sense of time. But also the other I think immediate thing that came to mind for me too was it's really interesting because, you know, all the figures that we look to, like Baldwin and King and, you know, Howard Thurman especially, they're in many ways their frames of reference, and I know we've talked about this before, but their frames of reference are essentially the early Christians who were essentially were forced underground during the original Roman Empire, not the Holy Roman Empire, which came later. And I remember there's this very striking passage, I think in No Name in the Street, where Baldwin says, and this is in like the To Be Baptized part of No Name in the Street, where he says, in spite of our grim situation, and even facing the possibility that the Black Panthers, for example, may be smashed and driven underground, they, that is, the Black people here, yet have more going for them than did those outnumbered Christians running through the catacombs and digging the grave, as Malcolm X put it, of the mighty Roman Empire. So that's like the original Roman Empire. And I guess I bring that up because, you know, Baldwin references it, King references it as well. I think, you know, in his, I think when he's writing that essay, Paul's Letter to American Christians, Howard Thurman, obviously in his work, Jesus and the Disinherited, frames the figure of Christ himself as essentially a political revolutionary, as part of an oppressed group in essentially the kind of grips of the original Roman Empire. And that is kind of, I feel like, what provides the kind of, not just the theological, but also the philosophical sustenance, which then creates the kind of conditions for the civil rights movement to emerge. But I remember, I guess, going back to the film screening of the Baldwin documentary that we did at Zion, I think part of what is interesting to me is that on the one hand, when I guess maybe myself or other younger people, whether you grew up in the church or didn't grow up in the church, you know, we have all these questions. And the point of the questions is not to like, you know, it's not even so much to blame anybody. It's not really even to blame like older generations of people who are like in the church, but it's really to ask questions of like, okay, like why are essentially all of these generations of young people, especially fleeing from the church, and, you know, trying to find answers elsewhere. I feel like obviously there's a lot of kind of resistance that you meet and kinds of defensiveness that you meet, but I do think the larger question that's left unanswered is whether or not, depending on how you feel about it, the church itself, whether it's, you know, the mainline Protestant denominations or even like all these old churches in Europe, essentially across the Western world, the church itself is dying and in the long period of decline. And it seems to me that really what the answer is not even so much to try to reclaim the institutions of the church itself, but rather to reclaim that spirit of how King or Baldwin or how Thurman saw the original early followers of Christ, who were essentially driven underground and forced to kind of create something new in that context. And yeah, I really appreciated the way that you kind of laid out, like this long history, like what Martin Luther represented, what Thomas Munzer represented. Because I think I remember reading that actually Luther was very opposed to the German peasant uprisings, if I remember correctly. And he was very opposed to figures like Thomas Munzer. But then it's like still like those uprisings in Europe were only really possible kind of as part of the milieu and the kind of shifting of epochs with the Protestant Reformation. And I guess the last two things I'll say is that, I remember it's also really interesting because when you're going through these museums in Europe, you can also see it's not just that the Protestant Reformation kind of crystallizes like new forms of art, especially in like Northern Europe, I think, with like the Dutch masters and all of that. But also at the time too, the Catholic Church tried to implement what it called the Counter-Reformation. And so you have these like big ideological battles happening in Europe, and it basically the Catholic Church is trying to provide an answer to the Protestant Reformation, and also essentially to communicate ideas and to try to protect its rules through art, especially, and through kind of dictating new rules for artists. And I think artists like Caravaggio, those, I think they were kind of part of that milieu of the Counter-Reformation. So that's really interesting, and I think it does. All of this resonates with today, I think, too. But the other thing is, I feel like the larger question that I think is raised by all of this, and I know that we've also talked about it. I don't think that there's any, singular satisfying answer to this. But even when we look at the history of the church and the history of Europe, Marx and Engels will say like, oh, like all of this history, especially even Europe's own history, is the history of the class struggle. And I think obviously it is true that like so much of what has propelled Europe's history forward has been the struggle between the rising bourgeoisie and like the kind of feudal system or the mercantile systems and all that stuff. But I think this is my, I guess, question, like, is it accurate or is it more appropriate to say that, yes, it is a history of class struggle, but in that the history of the struggle of ideas is not subordinated to the history of the class struggle, but it's actually more on an equal level in terms of what is even driving Europe's own history forward, in which it's not just simply the base of class struggle and then ideology as a thing on top of it, but something in which it's much more dynamic and kind of integral, like kind of co-equal forces which are driving history forward of like, yes, like the development of classes, the development of like material forces in Europe's own history, but also the development of ideas. And those are kind of, I don't know, I was just thinking about that as like how we even understand like the logic of history and the logic of historical development itself, which I know also has, implications for how we look at America. But yeah.
Jeremiah and everybody else, I would recommend, I think it's in today's New York Times or yesterday, Ross Douthat has an essay on Christianity, and he thinks Western Christianity is going, but he talks about his trip to Italy recently and going to this Benedictine monastery.
Yeah, I wanted to say that this thing. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. What you had said about this history of the development of Europe and its sort of emergence through, these bloody wars and crises and ideological battles is important to study. And this whole thing of, oh, this is just the white man's history, so it's to be, discarded to the rubbish heap, which, postmodernistic, I completely agree with it, because
I feel like what they end up doing eventually, however, is to turn to European thought or European thinkers in some ways. Like when we talked about Judith Butler sort of gravitating towards like the German philosophers, and I was thinking it's also possibly right to put Angela Davis and her affinity to Marcuse and Adorno in that same category. But then what that does is, on one hand, you're saying something needs to be rejected, but then I think it sort of shuts the door on being able to take it in its whole and assess it for its strengths and weaknesses, or the process that produced it, and then have an honest interpretation of what to take from it and what to discard. And I feel like what you said about the anti-colonial struggles not being against modernity but being against empire, which modernity had given its intellectual political assent to, was very important, because that to me seems to be the more, like, sober and almost scientific way to think about history. Or maybe I'm thinking about like the Hegelian way to see history, which is that, you see this as basically the manifestation of man's reach towards a higher consciousness, or the struggle to be more and more free, and that being history, the narrative of that being history. And I feel like both the anti colonial struggles and the Black freedom movement in this country, in trying to think of the question of modernity not overdetermined by how the West saw it, was a view of was that kind of a view of history, which did not reject the essential urge for why modernity even became, one of the things that people were striving for, but in some ways tries to correct the, like, the excesses of Western modernity in its ascent towards empire. And I think even, like, this also the question that you raised of knowledge and the crisis of knowledge, which is, I think you said it's also the crisis of civilization, or I forget how you put it. It reminded me a lot of what Du Bois is trying to get at when he talks about, Galileo and the Christian church and so on and so forth. Um, Always bringing it back to this thing that, yes, there's science and there's new discoveries to be made, but none of this can be sustained without a moral core, where, it's not, science is not a thing in itself, or progress in science is not a thing in itself, but it is for a purpose, which is to take humanity forward in that, like, in that particular view of history. And it also reminded me of something that I forget where we discussed it, but it's definitely come up, of this idea of social consciousness and the social being, where the idealist or the positivist, sort of position would be that the social being and social consciousness is basically the same, they're identical. Whereas Marx and Lenin would put forward the idea that social consciousness reflects the social being. It is an approximation to the the material conditions and the existential conditions of a particular society in a particular time. But then I feel like today we can go even further than that and say that social consciousness not just reflects social being, but can also affect social being, which is where that revolutionary drive, or the drive for new art, new knowledge, new science comes from. And I think that is what I was thinking about when you sort of, I don't know if you made the point explicitly like that, but that's how I took it, that the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, I mean, basically a Renaissance always seems to precede a revolutionary moment which takes humanity to a higher stage wherever, you know um, so there's that. And then one other thing that I have more questions than conclusions about is, this way you were setting up the relationship between the church and then modernity. Because if the Holy Roman Empire, or the Christian church as an institution, was a way for an ideological and political organization of society or people, then modernity can also be seen as an as providing an alternative to the same thing, like a different way of a different mode of ideological and political organization that was based more on science and rationality, and the rational man or the rational individual, so to speak. But then I feel like, I don't know if this is right, but it seems like both the church and modernity, both of them, because they gave their assent to empire, there was something that remained unresolved. Modernity could not complete that departure from that old form. And I think my question would be, how did this play out in, say, the world wars, for example? What these forces in conflict, or were they in tandem with one another? And the rapprochement that comes after World War II, which you said, was that in favor of peace as a universal like a philosophy to unify people, or was it to form a sort of like coalition between Western modernity and Western religion to allow the idea of empire to still exist? Like they couldn't do it at odds with each other, but maybe coming together, the idea of empire could still be kept alive. Anyway, these are just some questions I have.
By the way, Purba, you all say it much better than me. I'm sitting here smiling because I said, wow, I wish I could have said it like you all said it. But, in this long sweep, when you mention the two world wars and then the finality of the finality that the Second World War represented, clearly, once the bourgeoisie had established itself as the ruling class, and the church, and they had, in some ways, pretty much subordinated the church as a center of political power. It was more symbolic, and then it ends up like Jeremiah describes it today. It's a museum piece and not an active force. But the resolution of the crisis of bourgeois rule, which was manifested in the two world wars, because once they had defeated the church, then the bourgeoisie fought each other over which would be the dominant nation, in Europe. It was resolved by World War II when the United States becomes dominant and the glue that holds all of Europe together. And in a lot of ways, one could say the European ruling elite had given up any pretense of being a world force and said, well, the United States, you all handle all of that. So they abandoned even their own nations and any sense that France or Germany could become a powerful center of a national bourgeoisie. And they said, no, we can only exist under the hegemony of the United States. It was a resolution. I don't know that I'm making the best sense right now. It was a resolution where after two world wars, after having been weakened and almost ruined the European bourgeoisie, and those were horrific wars, the two world wars probably killed close to 50 million Europeans. Europeans killed more Europeans than Europeans killed of third world people, so-called third world people. But what does Europe do? They abdicate and give all power to the United States. But now what happens when the United States empire is in decline, is being challenged? A ruling class in the United States, which is not confident, which is not proud, which does not stride across the world with its arms and its ideas and its science and its universities, can no longer claim that hegemony. Now, Europe, which gave all power to the United States, abdicated. What do? in the face of this decline. This is, and I think in some ways this defines this moment of crisis. And this is why it is very similar to the overturning of the rule of the church. It took 400 years, something like that, in Europe. It won't take that long this time. But we do see a ruling class. And I could imagine the church elders, the church leaders back in that time had just given up. We can't do anything. Let us retreat into our monasteries. Let us retreat into building these great churches, this great architecture, etc. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, that's the kind of thing I'm trying to say. But you all say it so much better than me. I have to acknowledge that. Oh, by the way, I do agree with you, Purba, that it is not, the ideological struggle is more than a reflection of material relations, so to speak, what are called material relations. And I think this is what Jeremiah was getting at also, that the Renaissance precedes the all-out assault upon the church by this new class, which would take several hundred years to consolidate. In some ways, the question of art and science, I guess you could say, or science framed by art, science framed by the human. This is Du Bois's, science is a great mistress, but there's something greater, and that is humanity. But what is the voice of humanity? The voice of humanity is not merely science. The voice of humanity is more so art and consciousness. And so when Angela Davis studies the history of consciousness, the history of consciousness can be studied as the history of art.
Yeah, this is very interesting. I was thinking, as like when you're talking about this whole period and like the development of the Western Church, that at the I guess throughout the world, all revolutionary thinkers have looked to have looked to the West in terms of the philosophical basis on which to start from. I mean, the point that Purva was mentioning about Du Bois, talking about, man as a moral agent. I mean, this is also, I guess it comes from, it comes from Kant, right? I mean, the whole idea of, the scientific study of society, but at the same time to look at man as a moral agent.
Yes.
And I guess I'm thinking of, it's very important to realize what you're saying, that all of this in Europe, it comes out of a revolutionary period. I mean, it came out of the struggle against the church. And yes, we talk about the contradictions that that resolution had, the contradictions being, empire and so on. But I was thinking, back in I guess it's
You froze a minute.
oh, okay, just me. Right, in the 20th century, with the next stage of Europe, when it has been under, at the end of the 400-year long period of strife, when we are seeing First and Second World Wars, and possibly after the first also, the rise of, like, yeah, the Frankfurt School, but also later on the existentialists. That, that philosophical trend was, or the way I've thought about it usually is that it came about in a period of, like, complete moral and ideological confusion, and which sort of, like, that's why the beginning of, like, like the reinterpretation of Nietzsche, so to speak, to say that, like, to say that ultimately there is no answer, to take from Nietzsche to go and, to go to the absurdists and so on. But then, like what you were saying, it made me think that the whole of, like, from 1500 onwards and so on, this was also a period of strife. But then I was trying to, make the distinction that European philosophy that came about in the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries, there is something fundamentally different from what comes about after. And I guess today the reaction, or, like, whatever the postmodernists try to, put forward, it ultimately coincides with, Europe of the 20th century, but a rejection of Europe of the 16th century. And, like, to see that, okay, like, we are really talking about a philosophical basis that arises out of a revolutionary struggle, as opposed to that which arises out of chaos. So I guess this also, goes to what we were talking about some time back about, crisis and chaos, and, two different kinds of, uh, like, frames of thought come out of, the same place. So I wanted to put that because, yeah, I guess this is not very, it's not very clear in my head either about how these distinctions came about in Europe. uh, like, since both were, after all, as some kind of a response to a period of struggle.
Could I just say, apropos what you're saying, Sambarto, uh, and I appreciate the fact that there are many, many questions that are raised in this looking at history in this way. And, in the period right before the start of World War One, within the revolutionary or leftist movement in Europe, you had what would be two trends. One, the trend of social democracy, represented by the German Social Democratic Party, which most revolutionaries were part of, most European revolutionaries. And you see this battle between Lenin and the German Social Democrats. In particular, I would say Karl Kautsky and Edward Bernstein. The crisis, as Lenin saw it, the crisis of modernity could only be resolved in bringing down the bourgeois regime or the bourgeois state. For Edward Bernstein and Karl Kautsky, it was a question of the evolution of the bourgeois state. And social democrats, for example, the Bernie Sanders AOCs and their followers within the Democratic Party, they believe in reforming the Democratic Party and reforming the American state. Martin Luther King and the Black Freedom Movement on the other side were more committed to a revolutionary transformation and said it. Bernie Sanders is not a revolutionary, he is a reformist. King is a revolutionary. You see what I'm saying? And in an analogous way to Lenin debating, let us say, with Edward Bernstein, who argued that that the evolution of capitalism would bring about a necessary evolution of democracy and a lack of necessity of a class conflict. King raises, like Lenin, that evolution was not the answer. a revolutionary transformation was necessary. So the essence of what Lenin was seeing as a resolution of the crisis of modernity is similar to what King saw. And that's why, Baldwin is a uncomfortable presence for the postmodern movements of this time, because they are talking about reform and, well, not even, I don't know what the hell they're always talking about, but they're talking about the individual. And King was talking about a change which would bring people to power, the masses. So I think all of this is very interesting for our time. And I think for this crisis at this time, I guess our greatest task is to prevent world war or war and genocide, period. And that is not a lesser of two evils, kind of calculus. It is war or humanity or science, but humanity first. And so I agree with what you were saying. The framing of the crisis and the way out of the crisis through the lens of, and I put quotes, class conflict, comes off as reductionist rather than as a creative attempt to understand how we get beyond this crisis. And part of the creative thing, and this is why I agree with you, Jeremiah, you have to think anew about the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, all of this history. And what was it? And what can we learn from it? And how similar is all that history to this crisis? And I'm suggesting that the crisis of the church and its rule, and the church didn't want to give up. They fought tooth and nail over centuries to hold on to power. Why wouldn't they? There's a lot of money involved. But it is similar to what we're experiencing. I think with the added dimension, because we can see it so clearly, of a ruling class that begins to question itself, begins to question, well, can we, like they took, like Trump, we're going to put tariffs on you, we're going to sign. Is that the best you got? Is the resolution of the crisis the consolidation of American empire or the retreat from it? And I think these are the terms that the debate must go forward on, and there has to be, I'll shut up. I'm sorry, forgive me.
Well, I think actually to what you're saying, there's been this interesting. There's a 2-part series of opinion essays in the Financial Times by this guy named Ruchir Sharma, who I think might be a British Indian guy. But he basically is making the argument that the United States itself is the biggest financial bubble and economic bubble in history, and that this bubble is about to burst, and that U.S. exceptionalism itself is about to burst. And all of this is, again, so clearly ideological, because what even is a bubble itself, other than not just kind of productive forces and all this stuff, but actually ideology itself operating and shaping where people place investments and the degree of faith that they have in the United States as this kind of exceptional superpower that can kind of, you can kind of hedge your bets, and all that stuff. And so I don't know, that's been very interesting to see. But my larger, I guess, framing and kind of philosophical question is, even what do we include within the scope of what we call modernity itself? Because I think this is part of what I've been a little bit confused by, because it seems that it seems wrong to, for instance, say that modernity is kind of primarily defined by the rise of the bourgeois class, for instance. And yet we see the rise of the bourgeois class as part of, the what constitutes the possibility for modernity. But I think we would say it's a mistake to say that modernity itself is constituted by, the rule of the bourgeois class in Europe, for example. And I think this is part of the larger question of, like Emily raised it as we were talking about, like, what is the difference between European modernity and white modernity, and all of that stuff. And I think that all of these are important questions, because I think I'm I'm wondering even like how much like I think part of what we're moving towards is saying we don't really define modernity itself as principally constituted by the rule of a certain class, or the kind of epoch of rule of a certain class. Although that may be part of it, but I think yeah.
Not. Why is modernity not the struggle? Let me just ask, why can't we see modernity as the struggle of the bourgeois or capitalist class to achieve power against a former ruling class concentrated in the church and built upon the wealth of the feudal system?
Right. Well, I guess that's my question, because it seems like modernity is birthed, and the possibilities for modernity are birthed exactly by that struggle.
Yes.
And yet we would say humanity must actually achieve the promise and potential of that modernity, which was first put on the table by essentially Europe going through like the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolutions, and all that stuff. And so I think part of it is that also, I guess, because what we are looking towards in the future is not something even after modernity per se, but a new stage of modernity itself. And so this is partially my question of like what is included within the scope of what we call modernity, also related to how it's brought into history itself. But then like we're saying that actually we're still looking for a new resolution, which is in many ways the achievement of the promises of modernity, which would be after what we would see as after then the still after the rule, like the downfall of that class.
Precisely, and hence we, Free School, we do not see the resolution of the crisis of modernity in post-modernity theory.
Yes. Right.
The question, however, and I think it's a question, does what we call modernity, can modernity go forward without the liberal bourgeoisie or the liberal state?
Right.
And if so, on the side of the American ruling class, they would say no. If you want to go backward, if you want, be like Kim Jong-un or be like Xi Jinping, or, that is the opposite of modernity, but modernity is defined by the liberal bourgeoisie and the liberal state, they would say. The question for us is, can modernity go beyond the liberal philosophy, liberal bourgeois state, and would it still be modernity? And that is, I don't know that we know the answer to that.
Right. Okay.
I want to say basically what I think about it, because this has been very confusing. And I think I'm making some sense of it, where the idea of modernity, I think, to me suggests basically the world that came into existence after, the machine revolution or the industrial revolution, where human beings had to fundamentally change the way they not only lived life, but also thought about life, or thought about their future, or thought about social relationships or human relationships, because of that almost like, I don't know, just like a rupture in what existed unto that point. And while modernity is, like you said, defined by the liberal bourgeois class in Europe coming into its own in opposition or by defeating the ideological hold of the church, I think for all of humanity, because this didn't remain contained to Europe because of colonialism, because of the world wars. This was something that touched the whole world, but what touched the whole world was the aspect of this needing a new philosophy of life, or a new way to, yeah, a new everything, a new way to be human, which for the rest of the world was not so tied to the question of the liberal bourgeois class in Europe. Those questions were universal enough for, Asia and Africa, Black America, to have that urge to try and answer them on their own terms, on the basis of their own civilizational and moral values. And I think we are living through a time where there is a great possibility for that process to actually be taken to its conclusion, which is why we talk about colored modernity being modernity in its making, where basically you're talking about human beings everywhere in the world, not just in Europe, not just white, not just, the bourgeois, liberal elite, whatever you want to call it, but human beings everywhere coming into their own in this moment. Um, in through democratic struggle, through revolutionary struggle. I don't know, does that make sense? Is that, yeah.
In the world. I mean,
Mhm.
it's, see, if one were to ask the question, what are the tasks, first of all, of the American people at this time? One question. The second one, are they achievable by the American people? You know, and this is why the whole postmodernist theory doesn't help us at all. Cornel West's concept of catastrophe doesn't help us at all, because both postmodernism and Cornell are nihilist, philosophical nihilism. And you can find the language of nihilism most expressed within existential philosophy. And to the extent, let us say in India or China or Africa, this becomes, postmodernism becomes modernism and defines the task, let us say, of a country like Ghana. Oh, we're a free country. We have a gay pride parade. I don't know what else they would have. We have legalized same-sex marriage. We have freed the individual. And so Ghana is, quote, proud that it has these rights for the bourgeoisie, while poverty is prolific there, as in many parts of Africa. So yeah, I think the ideological clarity around the task, but I think the American people, because of the position of the United States in consolidating the West and modernity, the ideas of modernity, is so critical, because in a lot of ways, a good part of the world is following the U.S. culture, the U.S. ideology, and imitate it, etc. The U.S. is so pivotal, and the U.S. people are so critical in this. So if one says, well, they don't count, they're nothing but racist and misogynist. You know what I'm saying? Which means they can do nothing positive. Or Gerald Horne, the history of the United States is the history of counter-revolution. And the future of the United States can only be counter-revolution. Well, come on. I mean, it's a lot to untangle. I mean, both psychologically and ideologically. How do you live that way? I mean, how do you live? I mean, it seemed to me that you're always on the edge of suicide. If that is in your own country, if all you see is its history is a history of count. Now, no country can say, that its whole history is a history of counter-revolution, except the United States. I mean, come
That's
on.
another kind of exceptionalism.
Say that again, Jerry?
It's another kind of American exceptionalism.
Yes. So you could see Gerald and Cornell can be really good ideological buddies, as they are. You know, whereas for myself, with both of them, I would be seen as well. I don't know what I'm seen. At least not as smart as them, and I wouldn't contest that at all. By the way, you know, but you know, I mean, see, and then let me just say, this is why this opening up of a wide discussion in America, among American people, among American elites, among American intellectuals and ordinary people, and especially Black folk, is so important.
Yes.
It's so very, because if you get this wrong, you can set back what seems to be an emerging movement for decades. If it's just all catastrophe, if it's only counter-revolution, why be concerned about the American people? In fact, you should have utter contempt for them. That's Gerald Horne. That's what he's saying. And he does, by the way. He does. The only hope for the world is somewhere else in the world. And somewhere else in the world, people are saying, well, there is something about what you all have created over your historical time that we can see in our own futures. That's China. I mean, you know, that's this whole debate. Oh, is China capitalist? Oh, China's capitalist, so we have to discard it. They've abandoned their revolution and so on and so forth. The question is, well, have they?
Right.
What evidence? You see what I'm saying?
I've been thinking about this question from the concept of the individual. I've been thinking about this concept of the individual a lot, and how if modernity is actually based upon this concept of freedom of the individual,
Right.
or what does that actually mean? You know, because in a way, liberal bourgeois philosophy took the concept of the individual and made it into individualism.
Right.
Like, it was a kind, in my head, it was a kind of reaction uh, against the reductionist, deterministic kind of view of the individual that the church had. And then so you go complete opposite. But then, you know, in reading like Eastern philosophy, or even reading Baldwin and King, I think that they also focus on the individual, but in a very different way,
Yes.
right? And something that you said, where you said that, you know, the anti-colonial struggle was not against modernity but against empire. I think that made me kind of try to separate these two concepts a little more, where you can focus on the individual and still not be individualistic, or focus on individualism. And where, you know, a lot of Eastern philosophy says that, you know, you have to develop the individual, you have to develop yourself, grow, so that you may serve a greater purpose. And and you know, like, thinking about the church, I always default to Baldwin because he speaks so much about the church, and you know, he has a very different idea of, he also focuses a lot on the individual. He says that salvation is personal, it's individual. He says that, you know, King made the struggle come into the realm of the individual will. You know, all of these things make me think that there are, like, liberal bourgeois theory takes the concept of the individual, distorts it, so that there is a more, you know, trying to sort of go over the the solution to modernity, I want to go over that and go straight into postmodern theory, whereas everything else feels like, okay, we have to come to a resolution of this concept of modernity first, right? And yeah, and the one thing that really I was really reminded by during this whole conversation is that part in Fire Next Time, where
Yes.
I remember we read it at Zion recently,
Mm-hmm.
where Baldwin says that the concept of God is to serve the purpose of to make people larger, freer. I don't remember what he said. He says
Mm-hmm.
makes us larger, freer, and more loving. And if God cannot do this, we must get rid of him. And I think that that is also something that we are witnessing in today's time with when we have a representative democracy and people think that if this concept of if this whatever the concept of democracy that the US or the Western empire has built up over these years, if it cannot do these things, we must get rid of it. And I think that is the situation that is where we have come to,
And see, this is where Baldwin is a antidote to postmodernism,
Mm-hmm.
because on the individual, Baldwin says that the West, you contradict yourself when you have made millions of people property. So what are you so or at Zion we're now reading, and we read it at Lucian Blackwell, uh, the essay Freaks and the American Ideal of Manhood. It, first of all, is a work of great genius, but it establishes what the modern concept of gender must be and what it must reject. That is the American ideal of manhood, which defines womanhood and etc. I find, in other words, sometimes I think it's either Baldwin or the abyss. It's not postmodernism. That it's not queer theory, which is the apogee, the epitome of postmodern theorizing these days. Queer theory. And it I was talking to Emily. Emily and I were talking yesterday, and she and Serafina are trying to write a play. And we was could I expose it, Emily? Don't mind me. But we were talking about these two essays, Du Bois's essay, The Damnation of Women, which in some ways might be a foundational essay in understanding the modern gender theory, not modern as it is, but a new theorizer, and Baldwin's Freaks and the American Ideal of Manhood. A drama based upon those theoretical foundations might be something so explosive as to, and thus present a way out other than the postmodernist theorizing.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think. Oh, someone else.
No.
Oh, just that I think from our experience at the Blackwell Library, like to what you're saying, it's so clear that Baldwin has put questions on the table which postmodernism is totally ill-equipped and unable to actually answer. But it's like those questions are still on the table. And yeah, whether it's like questions of like gender and of like
Marriage.
identity and yeah, like just like social relations, like family, all that stuff. And I think yeah, part of the task that we're undertaking is like actually try to take up those questions on those terms rather than trying to like fit Baldwin into these like pegs of postmodernism which don't fit, and which also I feel like postmodernism itself, from like people who have actually been forced to kind of go through that mill, it's like it doesn't open new questions, it just closes all the questions of actual human existence. But I wanted to say something, I guess, also more about just like how, like, yeah, like the question of history, because I think part of the conundrum of, let's say, like King or Baldwin or Du Bois is that, I guess this is maybe my open question, but I think like also I feel like Lenin has this concept of like history moving in like a spiral, you know? And I think this is also, I guess, I remember also Raju had made the formulation that maybe history proceeds like a helix structure, where it's like twisting through time, basically. I don't know. I was very confused by it at the time, but I guess the maybe the concrete manifestation of what I'm asking is, you know, how is it that the American slave system and transatlantic slavery, all of that stuff, which on the one hand appears to be almost a carryover of ancient feudal relations, right, of slave relations in the ancient world, yet births the most advanced section of the modern proletariat in world history, which is the Black proletariat. This is, I think, the conundrum of how we even think about history and historical development and progress, where it's on the one hand, like, I think it's also like, let's say someone like King, for instance, it's like, I guess what I'm trying to work out is, you know, part of how you could define like the pre-modern period of human history is like the subordination of the individual human being to the larger community, to the larger collective. And that is kind of the role that, like, there is not really in that sense much of a concept of the individual. And I think that part of what we have seen is like essentially with the kind of development of European modernity and all that stuff, is the exhaustion of essentially like this concept of the individual, which was first put forward by European modernity. And I think part of what King and Baldwin move towards is not a return to kind of pre-modern forms of human existence or social relations, but is in many ways almost like, if you look at it through as like almost like a cyclical way, it's like, in order to resolve the unanswered questions of modernity itself, you need to do something which, on the one hand, gestures, it's like almost the pre-modern, but is not actually a return to the pre-modern. Because I feel like this is also where like the MAGA movement, the Trump movement itself, is almost at the dead end, because all it can really do is try to return to some period of American history which preceded kind of essentially the advent of deindustrialization and postmodernism. But it's like, you can never do that. Like, even if you try to gesture towards something which was before all of that, history has still moved forward. And I think part of the, I guess, yeah, like the task is like, when King talks about the beloved community, that is not, on the one hand, the complete rejection of the individual, but it is essentially, in order to move history forward, you need to gesture towards something which is, on the one hand, both ancient and modern, if that makes sense. I don't know if I'm making complete sense, but I feel like you need to gesture towards something which is actually new, but yet contains some semblance of the old. And I don't know, I feel like that is what I've been trying to work out, because I feel like, on the other hand too, like, I guess on the flip side, like, let's say the genocide that Israel is carrying out in Palestine, for example, is this a sign of the strength of Western civilization, at the apex of its power, or is, ironically, the genocide that Israel is committing in Palestine with the full partnership of the US, is this in some ways a sign of Western civilization almost reaching its most nihilistic and almost weak phase in its own history of also the history of the world, which is not to discount also the dangers that presents, but I feel like there's this kind of tendency, I think, for people who are on the, like, I don't know, we call themselves leftists, to always view things as like, oh, like this is the U.S. is coordinating all of this, the U.S. is behind all of this, the U.S. is like is basically untouchable as a world power, and I feel like that's a mistake to simply view things as like, oh, like this is always the kind of everything is a legitimation of Western kind of untouched Western hegemony, and rather instead to maybe look at it as more like, oh, like actually what Israel and the West are doing in Gaza is in many ways a reflection of like this is like the last gasps of a dying epoch, which is so desperately trying to like hold on to its own rule. But I don't know. Yeah, I was just thinking about like, yeah, like is it possible to resolve the contradictions of the modern world in a way that both gestures and harkens back to almost something which is pre-modern and yet is still fundamentally new and actually moves history forward?
Yeah. Well, this format is kind of hard because, like, when you guys are speaking and then where our room is on mute, I like turn to everyone, and instead of asking you, Doc, in the other room questions, I just ask my own pod a question, which kind of like defeats the whole purpose of like the general discussion. But I kind of resolve my own question of the difference between European and white modernity, because basically your overview, Doc, explains that with like even the Renaissance, Martin Luther and the Renaissance and Enlightenment, that was basically European modernity was trying to answer kind of this question of like human modernity, but that the invention of whiteness and white supremacy takes it off the rails and pushes it into a dead end where they would never be able to actually achieve modernity or human modernity. And that's why like the Black freedom struggle and the Black proletariat in America, and then the inheritors of the anti-colonial struggles around the world, have this unique responsibility to have more hope and also have a responsibility to like lead the way in achieving human modernity in a way that like what is now not just Europe but like the white world cannot. And the reason why I think that was important is because like in some ways, okay, this is probably just a repeat of something Perba said, but like it's all over Du Bois's work is the question of modernity. Because in some ways Baldwin does this too, where Baldwin is like, I'm not talking about white supremacy as in like an academic term or an academic category. Right. What I'm really trying to say is that what we call white supremacy, which now in 2024 is very much academicized in critical race theory, that's kind of like this timeless concept.
Static. Yeah.
This static concept is like, Baldwin would always be like, no, what I'm questioning is our understanding of life itself.
Yes.
Like, or like human, our concept of like human life, what life is itself, human beings. And like Baldwin and Du Bois kind of pick up the uncompleted questions of human modernity that humanity is now today required to kind of achieve. Like China's doing it in its own way, India has to do it in its own way, and in America there's a critical role that like the American people have to play. And that was kind of interesting because like Du Bois, when we just read his essay, The Damnation of Woman, and essentially like something we talked about is like, this is related to something Perba raised up and then Jeremiah said, which is modernity does coincide with the rise of a kind of what we like associate with industrialization, like the Industrial Revolution. And here, like women, for example, women, like societies don't have to necessarily be based around the same social relations anymore. Like where women don't have to just be at home, but like now women have to work, or women can work, or and like men are also working, and new human relations and like our understanding of life itself or human beings themselves has to be kind of like renegotiated, redefined, which is why we always talk about free school as like, who is the new human being? Like that's why we're always like the new world, the new human being, new society. And like Du Bois is basically like, I'm not talking about black people because I'm black and I like black people, but I'm saying that something in the black world, the African American people, has advanced thinking that could help humanity achieve modernity. And like even the concept of the damnation of woman, which is that like in modern society, why is there a contradiction between healthy babies? Why can't we have healthy babies and intelligent workers? Like, why can't women have healthy babies and be intelligent workers? Like, and rather there being kind of this a clash of ideals of like a clash of ideals because of marriage, where women have to either be like women either feel like children in marriage are kind of an imprisonment and are preventing them from being intelligent workers, or they don't work and instead like are in marriage. I don't know. So that and then Du Bois makes the point where he's like, that's actually a modern problem. It's not a like America problem. It's not a developed country problem. It's a problem of modernity itself, because of the way that human beings have advanced. Even the conditions have changed, and like the mechanics or the material conditions have advanced, but like human beings have to advance thinking in order to like create better or different relations, human relations themselves, or thinking itself, so that human beings are like happy or healthy or whatever, those things. And so Du Bois is basically like, actually black people in America have made advancements where it's not a contradiction to be a worker and like have children and in fact cherish motherhood, because like in the community of slaves, like Angela Davis says, black men and black women were both workers. They were slaves. There was no womanhood, manhood. It was just everyone was a slave. And in fact, being under slavery made you appreciate motherhood and cherish children and want children. And it wasn't a contradiction. And in fact, the fact that women had to be strong and like resist and be workers just as much as men made black women especially beautiful in the eyes of men. Whereas like under white standards, womanhood, femininity was defined by like purity, like purity before marriage, and like being a mother and being in the house, like different standards. Anyways, my point is that like this was kind of clarifying to me, to kind of like just explain related to Jeremiah's question of like what is considered within modernity, because in some ways the whole idea of the ancient and the modern is that kind of like Robeson would say, it's exactly that I'm African. It's exactly that I'm everything African, or Du Bois like black people are everything African, but in America, and thus develop kind of like a double consciousness where I am both ancient and modern, that allows me to not just assimilate to, it has allowed me not just because of historical circumstances to like, I have been made we as a people have made a conscious choice and consolidated people or whatever to not assimilate to a white system, but in fact assert an advancement of modern thinking or modern resolutions of relations that everyone could look to. It's just that people choose not to look to it. And in some ways you see that with King, where like, I guess that's in some ways the misunderstanding of King, where King was not, whenever he talks about like the Christian doctrine of love, it's not because he's trying to save the Christian church, but because he's trying to say there's something about black people and engaging or understanding or reading and acting by Christianity and in that specific way that solves something for human modernity. Like the belief that like there's not just God, but that there's God in every person, or that like, just stuff like that, or that like Jesus is the oppressed, like Jesus is of the oppressed, or just, I don't know, so I'm kind of just making sense of all of that. Oh, let me unmute you, sorry.
I agree very much with what you're saying, Emily. And, just two things, by the way, that come out of our discussion yesterday on the phone. One is in thinking about Angela's essay, it is entitled Black Women in the Community of Slaves. I would just say, and there's an irony in the whole situation, because those women were also maybe the first really modern women. The women in the community of slaves may have been the first really modern women in all of their qualities and characteristics. The other thing is, and that idea in itself goes against modern day feminism, even modern day queer theory, and adheres more to Baldwin's idea of the American ideal of manhood. Baldwin argues, I don't want to make a big, Baldwin's argument could be interpreted that modern feminism, modern American feminism, adheres to the American ideal of manhood. But the other thing, and I think this is in Du Bois, and certainly I think maybe even Engels, but definitely Du Bois, and I think it's in Baldwin. The struggle for women's liberation is not to liberate women from society, but to liberate women from marriage. Now, I know that doesn't sound good, but the liberating of women from marriage means that it is not a condition of womanhood that you be married. So women can be married, but they're liberated from it to the extent that they don't have to be married. So Angela's modern woman forged in slavery, who couldn't be married and had to operate as modern women without marriage, are are representative of what Du Bois is saying in Damnation, of liberating women not from society and from the responsibility to build a new society and to free society, but to free women from marriage. I know that doesn't sound too nice. Oh, I'm sorry. And that's not against, I'm not against marriage. But I don't think it should be a condition for anything. You know, like I have friends, you know, who want to march down the street beating drums of how proud they are to have been married. You know, just like, forgive me for throwing a joke out here. Just like at our reading group in Zion, one guy was talking about he was in a power marriage and all that. And my response to him then is, so what? I mean, so yeah, but anyway, I don't want to bring myself into this. But this is probably the stumbling block. And modern queer theory does not answer any damn thing about women. It's like Baldwin said about the sexual revolution. It's neither sexual nor revolution. Modern day women's emancipatory theory is neither about women or freedom. Judith Butler is, and we said this before, is not about women, gender, or freedom. You know, because it does not understand the origins of modern womanhood and the concrete manifestation of that, obviously because you don't want to see Black women in it. But the other thing is, Judith Butler, you're more interested in liberating women from society rather than liberating them from marriage, which are not the same thing.
I wanted to add to what Emily was saying, and then Jeremiah also. I mean, I think I don't know if this is too, like, going too far to say that. I don't think it is. That the Western bourgeois class has basically abandoned the project of modernity. and
Interesting.
and now like that's sort of what you were getting at also, that the sort of impulse or the drive to really complete modernity will come from, say, black people, or started by black people in America, but today particularly we look to Asia, and for for new ideas, for new knowledge to sort of speak to those questions. What is the modern human being going to be like? And the reason why I say they've abandoned, the Western bourgeois class has abandoned the project of modernity, you see it in the sort of like the sterility of the art it produces, the literature it produces. But then, even if you go back to this thing that I've always associated with modernity, an industrial world, or the human being having to adjust to an industrialized world where people are workers, where men and women are workers. I mean, how do you then reconcile, this rampant deindustrialization and poverty in the West with the project of modernity? If not to say that, at some point this was abandoned by the Western bourgeois class. And the other thing that I wanted to say is to what Jeremiah was saying about whether it becomes sort of essential to reach back for something in the pre-modern. Whether I think that the only thing I would say is I don't even think it needs to be categorized as pre-modern, because the way I think Baldwin would say it, and actually Tagore is where I'm getting this quote from, where he says that I am in favor of the revelation of the human spirit, and wherever that happens, it's always modern. So I'm modern. So there is something universal or essential about the human being. I don't know how to say it. Like, it's not really that it's the pre-modern human being or aspects or something from the pre-modern human being that has to be carried forward to, the future, but something inherent about the human being and the way they relate to the world and to other human beings that is not fundamentally upended by something like the arrival of Western modernity. And the reason why I'm trying to make this point also is because of how disturbed I am by the newfangled definitions of women and men under postmodernism, where nobody can have even a clear answer. If you ask somebody, if you ask some of these postmodern theorists or radical feminists, what is a woman today? A woman is a woman is somebody who thinks they are a woman or feels like, that sort. So there are no answer. But then what I'm trying to say is that there is an answer to what is a woman, and it has existed as the answer for what is a woman from ancient times through all these different stages that the human being has gone to. And do we have to say it's a pre-modern idea then, or is it just something that's intrinsic or inherent in the human being that you should have abandoned to begin with? Anyway, these are just like a lot of stuff that's going on.
I was thinking about this already, but then you kind of brought it back to me, Purba. Trying to think about Jeremiah's question: how do you gesture at something ancient while accomplishing a modern task? Really, how do you bridge the ancient and the modern? And it seems like um, a devotion to humanity would bridge the ancient and the modern, situate the individual within a long context of human history and human development, where you're not estranged from it, but part of it. You have a debt to it and responsibility to it. I guess it's another way of saying, if my devotion is to humanity rather than individualism, that's another way of saying freedom to society rather than freedom from society. And that it seemed that Baldwin and King understood, as we were saying earlier, the individual, but in a way that was not individualistic or concerned with individualism, but the individual in relation to humanity, where you can bridge that ancient and modern, because you're a part of this long stretch of human history, and not just in it for yourself.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Joe. No, hey Blaze, I agree with you completely. And so therefore, how do we define the individual in this moment?
Mm.
And if my first effort at that would be to define the individual based upon the moral task before him or her. The modern human being must increasingly, I think here I'm in a line with Baldwin, be defined on the basis of his or her assumption of a high moral task, which can be concretized, at least in Baldwin's thinking, as love. The modern concept, the modern human being is both a being, a subject who takes on the moral task of humanity as such, but is also this taking on the moral is also a manifestation of love in both the King and Baldwinian sense.
Just to add, because I think I guess part of what I mean by like the pre-modern and modern is that I do, my general sense, and this may be completely wrong, but my general sense is that in what we would call like the pre-modern periods of human history, freedom itself was not really a central organizing concept for society. And it was much more, because society itself was much more organized around like essentially duty, around faith, around essentially like a sense of like moral duty. And I think that is crystallized in both good and bad ways, especially with like the rule, this epoch of the rule of the church, for instance. And I think part of what's interesting is in many ways like the advent of modernity places this question of freedom on the table, which had not really been consciously seen before as like a central question of human beings and of human society. But I think that part of what is needed today is essentially like a new concept of freedom, which itself is tied to like morality, and which is tied to one's moral duty to humanity, and which is tied to love, which I think has been essentially like where Europe was never able to actually complete the arc of its own development, was essentially seeing this question of freedom as totally divorced from like duty, or divorced from like morality. And I feel like this is also where one can see, like, let's say like Marx and Engels and Lenin, when they're saying like, oh, we need to move away from this kind of idealism towards materialism, that in many ways is them also saying that like we need to, I feel like this is, I guess I interpret it as like also this part of this long arc of the revolution against the church itself and the rule of the Catholic Church, in which everything is kind of subordinated to what the church claims is like, okay, this is what society is about, this is how society is organized, and it's all around essentially what we say is like morality. And them saying like, no, actually, like freedom itself has to be almost like divorced from this thing of morality, and it's purely about like liberating the human being from all of these constraints and all that stuff. Is like them kind of having that revolt against like the church and its kind of over determination of society through this kind of lens or this language of morality. And I think like where we've reached though is the point of history of humankind's historical development, in which the question of freedom is placed back into the fold of also the question of love and of morality, which is essentially what King and Baldwin and Du Bois put on the table. And that's kind of, I guess, what I mean, where it's like I don't know, we're taking modern questions, but also reframing them and putting them back into the fold of like this larger, essentially, like what it means to be a human being. And and I guess like the example too is like always to me the most beautiful parts of Black Reconstruction by Du Bois is like when Du Bois talks about the general strike and the coming of the Lord, where it's like
Mm.
the irony of it is that, when the black proletariat enter upon this great general strike of leaving the plantations, like they see it as like through the language of prophecy, which we've talked about so many times. Like they see it through the language of like, we see ourselves as like the in the same vein as like the Israelites fleeing from Egypt, like God's chosen people who, and they see it through the language of like biblical prophecy and through scripture and all these things. And this is not the black proletariat just trying to return to an older period of history, but this is them actually like literally through even like I think Du Bois has this line where he says like God is freedom for them. Like for the enslaved proletariat, God was freedom.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's part of what we're gesturing towards, where it's like there is no concept of freedom in today's society, which essentially is like divorced of morality, or is divorced of love. That is not freedom. Like nowhere, like that's not really freedom. Like that can no longer really be considered freedom. And like what I think we see is like the achievement of freedom for whether it's like Americans or for anyone in the world is like freedom through like love. Basically. I feel like I'm repeating myself, but yeah.
Wait, can I ask a question with respect to this? Because I think the part that confuses me is I don't know whether it is so much that freedom wasn't a category of in ways in which people thought before modernity. Because like if you think even about Buddhism and how it emerges and tries to correct some of those excesses and decadences that the Hindu religion had fallen into, and it emerges, the Buddha, he emerges as a prophet who has a philosophy for the poor and who says that you need to free yourself from this rank materialism. I think what I would agree with is maybe the category of the individual, or individuals freeing themselves of whatever structures they find themselves within, whether it's the state, whether it's the church. That might be a modern idea, which then you can
I'm mostly speaking about, I guess, what I know, which is Christianity, early, like kind of the early periods of Christianity. I feel like, especially in terms of the iconography, and just the language of religion, which I felt like I kind of sensed when I was there in Europe, is that like freedom. It didn't really seem like freedom was like something that people were really concerned about. At least through like those periods of like the Middle Ages and like or like leading up to like the Renaissance, basically. But then freedom becomes on the table, and then. But like I feel like part of what was centrally organizing society and stuff was more like I guess like themes of like devotion and like but yeah, I can only really speak to I guess Christianity, but I don't know about like, Buddhism, for example.
I think just to add to that, I think also science was also one of these avenues through which that modernity was it was kind of vehicle through which the modern concepts would be taken forward through time, and science was the ultimate representation in some ways of going against the church, going against determinism, going against like whatever the church represented before the Industrial Revolution and during the Middle Ages as well. And I think that currently, the concept of science has also veered towards this avenue where you think that science has to be divorced from society in some way, even though when it was proposed to be a kind of almost a savior. It was supposed to be for humanity, for the progress of for the forward movement of humanity, and now it is encouraged that science has to be a disinterested activity. It can't be related to morality, questions of morality. That is considered quote unquote bias. I think about this a lot in my research as well. Like, why am I conducting research? Why am I doing I can like when people ask me what I do, and I say, "Oh, I do cancer research," and they say, "Oh, that's so cool because you're working for humanity," and I don't know how to tell them that no. I mean, everything I do apart from my job at Penn is working for humanity, you know, in a way, because I think the way that science has become, it's like if you think about individuals, then your content becomes less scientific. If you try to include humanism in your scientific endeavors, it becomes less scientific, you know. And the reason why I've been thinking about this is because we're reading a book by Mulkraj Anand in our India reading group, and we're reading this book called "Is There a Contemporary Indian Civilization?" And there he posits this theory of scientific social humanism, you know, like where human beings play a central role in the philosophy of an emerging civilization, but it still has to have a scientific basis. Now, not all of the things that he says in the book, I think we agree with, but I think that this is something that I think King at least acknowledged that, you know, you have to have. I mean, he's a man of the church, but I think that he also had great respect for a scientific method, a scientific mode of thinking. You know, everything that he came up with, all the theory that he came up with, had a scientific basis in sociology, which cannot be divorced from the people who you expect to serve. You know, and that again makes me think about Du Bois, Baldwin, and King's idea of the individual versus what actually
Yeah.
what it actually became the most contributing factor to how science is done today. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
But which raises the question: is science being done today?
Right.
And the only reason I could raise the question, because I'm around you all, and you all tell me every day science is not being done up in here, or or the giving of Nobel prizes in chemistry and physics to entrepreneurs,
Mm.
or the claim that AI will solve all problems, and therefore we don't need scientists any longer. We just need computers. Um, I think all of this gets us back to the basic thesis that we're talking about today. The Western and American elites have abandoned any notion of progress, any notion of humanity. They're anti-human. And frankly, this is so ironic. Any notion of the individual.
Right.
So I'll shut my mouth. So much to say.
Right.
And the more we talk, and really the more I listen to you all, the more clearly it becomes to me that we're in a crisis not unlike the crisis of early modernity, when the church, as the authority of all things, had to be brought down.
Yeah, and this was probably one of the theses of our science conference that we had a couple of months ago, that this corrupt political ideology of the United States has completely pervaded the educational institutions. I'm going home in January, right? And I'm going home on the day that Trump is going to be inaugurated.
Damn. When you coming back?
A month later. Now, on the question of coming back, my advisor has been constantly emailing me all of these news articles and emails about how people are panicking that after the new administration comes into effect, that people on visas won't be able to come back. Like this is the kind of panic and paranoia that these individuals who are in top elite universities and top elite positions at these elite universities are trying to propagate. Um, that and I think this is a different kind of reaction than the first time. The first time the panic was more visual, like it was very visible, and now it's more subdued in the form of you should be worried about this. Like you, people who um, probably voted for Trump, you should be worried about what this administration
Yeah.
can do to you.
Mhm.
And they are trying to say that the people who have legally come into this country, who have visas, who have legitimate working statuses, they also should be concerned because this is uh, this is going to change the face. Trump's election is going to change the face of how politics or how things are done in this country completely. We're going to descend into a kind of authoritarian chaos, and it's very subtle the way the propaganda is kind of going out in comparison to I've just been trying to think about how it was before and how it is now. um, I don't think that the ruling class has been able to get over the fact that they have lost this very definitively, and they are scrambling.
Yeah. Mhm.
Well, to get back to the question of modernity, I was thinking, like, to this sort of, I guess, this debate about modern and pre-modern, that Jeremiah and Purba were bringing up. In some ways, I think, the question of modernity, or maybe not just modernity, but the, historical progress in, sort of the way Hegel sees things is, and this also comes out of, many thinkers from Asia, that like the progress of human beings is a creation, is to create new morality, to create new values. And I think the sort of the period that we think of as like the heyday of white modernity and of modernity itself, was that this process of the creation of values, the creation of new morality, was, as people have been also saying, like this process was opened up finally, or was in the process of being opened up to, like like all humanity, and not simply, the either the feudal like class, or like the priests, or like even the church and so on. And but the thing is that this process being opened up to all individuals, which is why we think of modernity as like bringing the individual to like the center of history, so to speak. This process also must have required, and it led to a lot of faith in the individual, the faith in the individual to be the master of destiny, so to speak.
Mhm.
But the
Mhm.
thing is, I think with like to go back to what we were initially talking about, this distinct, this change that Europe went through from the period of like revolutionary struggle, which led to the creation of new ideas and the Renaissance, art, and all of, and science and all of that, to the period afterwards, after the uh, like civil war in the US, and then civil rights movement, and essentially the world wars, the civil wars in Europe. The thing is, the change that this led to, I'm thinking, is uh, is a deep loss of faith in the individual, and which, in like Baldwin would say that it comes from, guilt. It comes from a like a worldview which starts with, like guilt that of course the ruling class is involved with, but then the ruling, like, this guilt is what drives their worldview. And this is, like, I think this is so like so much the state that the ruling class wants to see, like all humanity today. Ultimately, it, comes out of nihilism, and therefore the conclusion is pessimism or complete lack of faith in the individual. But without the faith in the individual, like, there is no possible creation of new morality, because ultimately morality comes from,
Mhm.
like, like all, like for instance, like how Gandhi says morality is not in like following the like the beaten track, or that set by the ruling class, but it's about you creating your individual path.
Say that one more time. It is what?
Like, it's to create your own individual path. So it's essentially an individual, it's a project that is centered in the individual. In the modern period, there is no creation of new morality without it being centered on the individual. But I think the idea of, yeah, like what we've been talking about, we have been talking about this in different ways over a few months, I guess. But how, like, Doc, your formulation of the individual and the human being, I think that's where it comes to, that ultimately the individual as viewed by white modernity, it's ultimately a negative conception of the individual. And it misses it. It sees, on the one hand, it does see the individual as not a creation of morality, but almost to flee from morality, like to flee from like a moral compass which has been the product of history. And the thing is, I think right now we are faced with this question, especially in this country, but of course in the world, that we are in the business of figuring out what is going to be, what the new human being is going to look like. So the question of what are going to be the new terms of a new morality, and this is a question for the individual. And I think, yeah, this is something that, to what somebody was saying before, like in Asia, and I think in Africa too, this question was being worked out, because it was recognized that this advent of the individual as an agent of history, it was an important advent which the world needed, which the entire world needed in order to progress. But then I think this is the change that, Europe was also going, like, went through with civil war, and uh, yeah, like 400 periods of war and so on. That the change that it went through, I guess this, brings me back to what you were saying about this, détente between the church as, like, the church being the, like, one of the vessels which was creating morality in the Middle Ages, or before. But then the advent of the individual required the church to be in tandem with science and reason. And I guess this is why, the question of the individual as an agent of history to create new morality, this seems essential to figuring out in what direction is the new, like, where is the new, like, the new human being being reborn, and like what is going to define it. Because I don't think the question of morality is, I think we sort of tend to think of the question of morality more in terms of the, the pre-modern or the ancient world, and as opposed to how King talks about it, or King or Gandhi, or any of, like Baldwin talks about it, that like morality is ultimately a question of the individual, of the individual human being. And this is like to also like go back to the essay that you were talking about, like Feeks and the ideal of the American ideal of manhood. I mean, he sort of starts with this, that the individual is at the center, because the individual human being has to take for granted that, like he or she is going to see the world with themselves at the center.
Yeah.
And I think this is so much perverted in like popular like discourse today, because like this, like one interpretation of this is, complete self-involvement, where your world yeah.
Can I just say this? I hate to interrupt
No,
you,
no.
Sambarta, but this is a very interesting thing, and it relates to Shantanu too about individualism. Let me propose that the individual in this epoch that we're living in assumes centrality to history. The individual is no longer what she or he was 3,000 years ago, 500 years ago. The individual now, and the individuals know this about themselves. They don't see themselves as sheep to be herded and told what to do, But that having been said, I think Baldwin would say, acknowledging that does not mean that we must put ourselves before everything else. In other words, let me put it another way. I thought it out, but that by acknowledging this new heightened role of individuals in history, not the great man theory, but individuals as such, is not a reason to then say that only I am important. It should not lead to narcissism and to nihilism. And postmodernism takes the acknowledgement, which is true, that individuals play a role in history they've never played before. That is, individual people. And thus, their constant push for more democracy, for more freedom, to be a part of every discourse, that individuals demand, not everybody, of course, but demand that we be a part of the movement of ideas, the decisions about policy. But then that should not lead to the wrong conclusion that being the case, it is only the individual that counts. In other words, saying the former does not lead to the latter, of which is narcissism and nihilism. And that is the conundrum of postmodern theory, of modern bourgeois theory. And I think the most energetic zone of bourgeois theorizing today in America is queer theory. Hence, it is problematic. I know when we're in our Baldwin reading groups all over the city, a person would say, as a queer Black man, or as a queer Black woman, I understand Baldwin better than people who do not identify themselves as queer. And just parenthetically, queer does not mean homosexual, even to queer theory, but it can. But I think it always, even when you hear it, and you've read Baldwin, when you hear a formulation like as a queer Black man, that has to be announced out of the gate in discussing Baldwin. If we were discussing Marx, or if we were discussing, let us say, King, I don't think a person would preface their introduction of themselves or of their ideas of as a queer Black person. Queerness would not factor in to the identity and hence the philosophy and worldview of the individual as it does today. And I think it is a retreat from Baldwin and an embrace, knowing it or not by the person, of a counter-revolution against humanity, away from humanity.
We lost them.
We done lost a lot of people.
No, I think that someone accidentally pressed the button. Anyway, go ahead.
I wanted to because I just remembered you had put it like this a while back, that the category of the individual should not sacrifice the category of the human being.
Right.
And because really, I mean, with Baldwin, really in the year of Baldwin, I think I finally fully understood what that means. Because when you use the human being as sort of the anchor for assessing the world and what's going on, then it leaves open that possibility of a broad unity, because I can see myself in you, you can see myself in me. But then the category of the individual, especially the way postmodernism, queer theory deploys it, I mean, it's always, there's you and then there's the other, and like you can like even narrow it down to we are of the same race, we are of the same nationality. I can still find something, some identity category that separates me from you.
Absolutely.
And immediately that's conversation over.
Absolutely.
So what Baldwin is saying, Du Bois is saying, and in some ways, I think you also find this in, the Eastern thinkers and philosophers, although they didn't really articulate it or advance it as much as Baldwin did, the centrality of the human being as a category, as almost like an antidote to the rank individualism that came with Western modernity. And to remind everybody that, if this person who you think is the worst person in the whole world, he's also a human being just like you, and you could have been that person, and it is a choice and your agency that stops you from being that person.
Well, I think this is not the most related to this question of the individual. Or maybe it is, but I think one of the interesting questions that came up in the Black World reading group was, if people just left the system of capitalism and whatever alone, would the system naturally collapse by itself?
Yeah.
And I think there's many ways to approach that question, but I feel like I would tend to say no. But I think largely like it's a question of like, is the problem of American society itself purely defined by capitalism and capitalist development, which I feel like we've talked about before, but also I think the question is not even, I guess, whether or not will the system collapse on its own, but also like even if it does collapse, or if people already recognize society in a state of collapse, the question is what will come out of that? What will come in its place? Because I think, it's also a question of, like, to what Doc raised earlier, it's like, what is the revolutionary task of the American people in this time? And is it achievable? And I think part of our, at least my sense of how we in the free school see that task is, like, we are trying to bring, in the most democratic sense, the most urgent and necessary discussions to the people. And to make those discussions the domain of the people. Because I think there's this, like, kind of sense that, like, revolutionary action simply means essentially like protesting, right? Like that's kind of the model that I feel like has been ingrained in our heads. But I feel like the more, in some ways, challenging and perplexing and more open question of like what will actually come next is like, can like essentially ordinary people come together and actually, one, even decide for themselves like what is the basis on which we achieve unity. And it's like, you can almost put it in an epistemological in a way of like, what will mediate our relationships to one another?
Right.
And will it essentially be queer theory, or will it be something else? I feel like that, like, this is literally what has been put on the table by the Baldwin reading groups. And essentially people are trying to be like, oh, like I can only relate to you mediated essentially through like queer theory or all this stuff. But I feel like this is part of the like the open task, which is not. I don't think many so-called activists see themselves as like, oh, like our task is to basically try to like go among the people and to try to actually bring out a democratic discussion. And it's much more about like, oh, like we as activists are going to act and like, yeah, like try to like, you know, confront the ruling class or like do these protests, which are like important. I think they are important, but it's like that does not actually solve the question of like on what basis will ordinary people, the people who actually make up this country and who essentially have lost faith in the ruling class, like on what basis will they relate to one another, and like how will they see their own relationships like to one another? What will they be mediated by? And this is essentially the question of ideology, but ideology in the most democratic and actually revolutionary.
Yeah.
But I guess should we read comments?
Oh yeah, we're gonna read comments now.
Would you say, Emily?
We're going to read comments.
Oh, great. I think, yeah.
We can start. So Todd Doherty, someone named Michelle Bell, Rhonda Crump, Bombalai 7 all say good morning. Good morning and Merry Christmas. Michelle Bell said, good morning and Merry Christmas. I watched long video footage of a scene at City Council yesterday. Oh my. 2025 will be very interesting indeed in Philadelphia because I think it was either yesterday or the day before the City Council officially, I think, passed the resolution to approve the building of the stadium. And then there was a big protest and people were arrested and carried out of City Council. Amalai 7 said, good morning, free school. Good morning, people in the chat, and Merry Christmas. Fired Play says, good morning, beautiful people. Someone named Hotline says, about the topic of Renaissance, it always reminds me of how impactful the Harlem Renaissance was upon the political strife of Black people. And then Rhonda Crump replied, the European Renaissance produced the Shroud of Turin, which is, let's say, a fake. Which I think I was looking that up. It was like a fake version, like fake Shroud of Christ, I think. I don't really know. And then the person named Hotlines asked Rhonda and said, oh, do you place no value in the Renaissance? And then later said, in response to our conversation, referencing Prophet Cherry and the Black Gods of the Metropolis book, with little to no Black people in the space in the live stream, makes me question, where are the Black figures in the community today at the free school? And then someone named Dan Feldman says, thank you all. I'm enjoying and learning with you every Saturday as I travel from Taiji Kwan to Bagua training sessions in Colorado. Is that a Chinese thing?
Yeah.
What is that?
It's a type of kung fu.
Oh, okay. Oh, kung fu training.
Ooh.
And then Michelle Bell says, the Church of England, aka the Anglican Church, of which the Episcopal Church is an offshoot, and today the Episcopal Church is distinguishable from, quote unquote, the worldwide Anglican communion, largely by social aspects, for example, allowing LGBT to serve as Episcopal clergy. And then Bombalai 7 says, the ruling elite is losing its credibility fast and appreciates the ton of info provided by Dr. Montero. Someone named Niagara Media says, there are 10,000 homeless children in Philadelphia public schools, but yet somehow it is important that we build a new and unnecessary basketball stadium in the center of the city. Rhonda Crump adds that Jalen Hurts, the quarterback for the Philadelphia Eagles, had to donate air conditioners for Philadelphia schools. Someone came to the Church of the Crucifixion today, but we weren't there. But we'll be back. And then Bombalai 7 says, interesting use of the word carcass to define European Glory Day structures like those cow bones in Death Valley. Or even, you know, there's that song Ezekiel and the Dry Bones, which is based off the biblical story. And then M. Sparks says, have a holly jolly Christmas, everyone. And then maybe you should.
Okay, Michelle Bell says, Dr. Gerald Horn has been way off lately, in my opinion. I Manifesto says, suicide, it's a suicide, bada bye. Bombalai 7 says, the US of Hollywood has a lot of influence over the world. Michelle Bell says, "Make America Great Again" is a slogan, but I don't think it paints the entire mission of Trump's newfound voter coalition, and probably not even the entirety of his base, at least not in 2024, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Gwendolyn Simmons says, "Dear Tony, thank you for your great opening remarks. Very informative and historically grounded. Thank you again. My only criticism and disagreement with you on what you said was what you said about Cornel West. Cornel ran third-party candidate against Biden-Harris. He broke with the Dems. How could you forget that? This is Zahara, by the way. Thanks for all you are doing with these young people. Hope to connect off this chat soon. Dear all, it is true that the mainline church is in decline, but the evangelical Christians are growing by leaps and bounds. They have young people joining in droves. Why? That's actually an interesting question.
Yeah, right.
That's pretty interesting. Basically, because we were saying that like young people are leaving mainline churches, but they're joining evangelical.
Also, evangelicals are also non-denominational.
Oh, evangelicals are non-denominational,
Or some of them are.
or some of them are.
I would
Experience.
I would question that, by the way. I know when I read it from, by the way, hello, Zohara. I don't think that's exactly true. The evangelicals, I think the Southern Baptists and the evangelicals are in decline. And one measure of it, I think, is that the evangelicals, while supporting Trump, did not play a huge role in this last election. I think they might be declining less than the mainline denominations, but I think they too are in decline. I could be wrong about that.
Bumley says the West is acting as one who has run out of options. Evangelicals, those who want to hasten the quote unquote end times, did they send gene manipulated red cows to Israel? Bumbley also continues, Zionism is the epitome of religious craze. M. Spark says manipulated modern religion is a big, white, washed joke. Wait, this is why mindfulness helps community. Okay, I think we should go over Jeremiah.
Okay. So there's a lot of people just saying different comments, but I Manifesto and Bombalai brought up Made Staples and the Staple Singers, the song Respect Yourself, also the song When Will We Be Paid by the Staple Singers, a remake that was remade by Prince, I think. M. Spark says, good thing Yin's stayed home today. It's snowing like a mother out there. And then BK says, it doesn't matter what quote-unquote ism the masses subscribe to. The ism will always be a reflection of the state of development and evolution of the masses. Individualism may result in positive outcomes if the individual strives for self-improvement and mastery, in turn creating a stronger mass and collective. I think change has to start on an individual level and not be top-down or dogmatic. And then Zahara says, Zahara says, Cornel West ran for president. As a third-party candidate, he worked his butt off. Why the attack on Cornel? Is running for president in the way that Cornel did, is that a nihilistic act? And I also differ with you about Joe 1-2. And then someone with the username Lenin Du Bois. Someone with the username Lenin Du Bois says, good afternoon. I have been enjoying Dr. Montero's lectures on philosophy and ideology. Also, I have visited the website and I haven't seen any new essays. Can I expect some in the near future? If you're referring to Avant-Garde, actually there are new essays on the Avant-Garde website, but you may be looking at the Free School website, which doesn't have new essays. But if you want to look at the ideological work that the Free School is doing, you can go to avantjournal.com for our publication. But M. Sparks then replies, Cornball West, emoji.
Can I just respond to something that my friend Gwendolyn Simmons, who is also known as Zohara, said? Cornel ran, but he didn't really run. And he abandoned the presidential campaign probably as far back as last March. And I think because he believed that his presence would help to elect Trump, and that was his worst nightmare. But I don't think I don't think Cornell was really running for president as such. The other thing is uh, Zohara. Gerald Horne is absolutely wrong, and there's no support for his position among historians or social scientists. Certainly, it is so anti Du Bois, anti King, anti everything in the Black movement. If the entire history of the United States is only a history of counter revolution, and our only future is more counter revolution, and the last election was a counter revolution, then what do we have to? I mean, let's throw in the towel, let's give up. And it is nihilism. And I think Cornell's position is ultimately nihilism in the philosophical sense, which we could go into more. But yeah, that's what I would say. I don't mean, that's my positions, Gwen. And I think a closer look at both of these thinkers would lead to, I think, what we're saying.
One last comment was BK says individualism may result in positive outcomes if the individual strives for self-improvement and mastery, in turn creating a stronger mass/collective. I think change has to start on the individual level, not top-down or dogmatic, which I think we agree with.
I don't.
Oh, never mind.
No, I mean, individualism is an ism. We were talking about the individual in a modern construal as a human being. And yeah, there are many things to say, top down, bottom up. Most things are not either or. Most historical and social processes are both, or all of that together. That's what's so interesting about our time and our history at this time. What will be, well, how will all of this come about? For example, one would hope that the Black church, the Black college and university, the Black community, the Black family could play a role similar to what it played in the period of the Black freedom movement. One would hope that. But one cannot just off the top say it will happen. So will this put greater weight of responsibility upon individual actors, given some weakness of institutions? And of course, the civil rights, when you take Martin Luther King, individual and the institution of the Black church. So in some senses, top down, but bottom up too. A lot of people who revise history want to say the civil rights was just a top down, Black preachers directing everything. Zohara Gwen Simmons was a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and a prominent actor in that period of individuals, and especially young people, taking up the moral call to change society. So I think I have my points. Emily.
Yeah.
It's almost 2:00. You think we could?
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's 1:55. So OBK says yes, both.
Yeah, both. Yeah.
Yeah. So we're going to end the live stream for this week. We hope everyone has a good holiday, this upcoming holiday week. And Doc, are we having free school next Saturday?
Pardon me?
Are we having free school next Saturday at the church?
I mean, what do you all think?
Okay, we will let everyone know about next Saturday free school. Probably we'll be back at the church next Saturday. So just so everyone who thought that who came to the church today and we weren't there, we will be back there next week. But hope everyone has a wonderful holidays and looking forward to next week. Bye.